Bonsoir.
Good evening. Bonsoir, Nigel, and bonsoir à tous.
Bonsoir, Joris, and welcome to our Bible study this evening at the Little French Church of Saint-Esprit. I'm Nigel, I'm the rector of the church, and Joris is with me, who is our theologian in residence, who is also well and truly on the way with the ordination process, so that's going to be fun. All right, tonight it's a slightly different sort of feel to the Bible study. The coming Sunday is the final Sunday in the church's liturgical year, the final Sunday in the season of Pentecost, which is also known as Christ the King Sunday. So we're going to be, it's more of a thematic study than the study, the dense study of a particular passage in the Bible. So, we're going to open with the Episcopal Church's recommended study questions for the week. Now, some of these may be relevant to what we look at now, but some of them are not going to be very relevant to what we're about to say. Here are the questions then. What kind of king is Jesus Christ? What signs of Christ's rule do you see today? How are we called to live in the light of Christ's rule? And in what ways do you imagine that the kingdom of God is different from the world today? There we go.
Questions.
So it's talking about whether or not Jesus is a king, how Jesus rules, all of those things that we see playing out in the whole of the church's year, really. But here we're looking specifically at a Christ the King Sunday.
Well, our first question will be first, is this feast really needed? Because the question has been raised many times since its kind of later creation and addition to the church's calendar. Because Christ the King Sunday is actually quite a very recent celebration in the church's calendar. It started in the 20th century, really, as Pope Pius the 11th instituted the feast on March the 11th, 1925. So you see, it's not even 100 years old.
It's not even 100 years old yet.
As a separate kind of thematic celebration. So we'll see why we wonder, and the church has wondered, and clergy has wondered, and popes even have wondered, I think, whether this celebration was necessary as such, or if there are any other celebration within the church's calendar that could actually make the work, fill the same purpose as this celebration. Knowing also that it's the end of the liturgical calendar, so maybe it has some meaning and can be helpful and interesting at this point. Yeah.
Just a little a puzzle to start with as we go on. Can you think of another Sunday in the church's year that celebrates a title of Christ rather than something that happened to Christ or something that Christ did?
Mm-hmm.
Have a little think. And if you can think of one, put it in the chat.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yes, Niño Jesús. Christmas is something that happened to Jesus. But yeah. Niño Jesús is good. That's a good example because that's a Catholic devotion. I don't think it's on a Sunday, but it has its own probably celebration in the calendar of the Roman Catholic Church. Just like there are feasts for certain devotions or Marian devotions, the Feast of the Holy Rosary and things like this, but it's usually not on a Sunday, and it's definitely the same type of celebration that is more something that happened, or like some form of ID around something, or around a saint, or around than actually something that happened, was part of the bio, if you want, of Jesus as we see it in the Bible. We're looking for biblical feasts.
Or biblical titled feasts of Jesus.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Hey-ho.
But yes, keep thinking about it. All the celebrations that we do in the church that are not in the Bible. Well, I'm thinking of Oktoberfest. That's
Oktoberfest, right? Well, but we do use the readings for that Sunday.
That's true. That's true. Anyway,
and Bastille Day too.
Bastille Day is
That's
not in the
something
Bible.
that happened to Jesus.
No, that's true. But let's dive a little bit into the history and the circumstances around the appearance of this celebration. So just basically a couple of months after Pope Pius the 11th publicized this feast, he published a encyclical letter, which is the type of letter that the Pope can write to give a teaching, an ecumenical teaching, that is a teaching given to the whole church about some topics or themes or mysteries. And it's in the one that's called Quas Primas, in December 11th, 1925, that he talks about it. Here you got a quote, Nigel?
Yes, that's a quote from it.
Yeah.
I thought it was an interesting quote. I mean, it's very much of its time, obviously. Men must look for peace of Christ in the kingdom of Christ. Okay. When once men recognize, both in private and in public life, that Christ is king, society will at last receive the great blessings of real liberty, well-ordered discipline, peace, and harmony.
Yes. That's very interesting.
Language.
Yes, it's a very interesting language. We're going to see a bit where it comes from and what's the implication of it. But maybe just at first, it's interesting to notice that the date chosen at that time, that is in the 1920s, just after the First World War, between the two wars, to celebrate this feast is the last Sunday in October. And in the European context, it's quite interesting because, you have had the German Empire, all of this development of a form of strong Protestantism within European universities as well, German universities rivaling with Catholic universities. So you have all this context of inter-Christian rivalry and tensions that are there. Still until recently, when you were in 1920s, there were stronger positions between Protestant and Catholics, especially in Europe. I mean, you can think of Ireland, for instance, at that time, which just was about to have its independence. Had its independence. But so many places in Europe, because we're at the time also thinking so much of the European context, but also the colonial context, where there was great rivalry between different missionaries, Protestant and Catholic, to colonize and spread their vision of the Christian faith. So this feast, set on the last Sunday of October, actually coincides with the Reformation Sunday. If you remember, Reformation Sunday in Lutheran and Reformed churches in Europe is a Sunday when people remember the Reformation, and especially the 95 theses that Martin Luther nailed on the Church of Wittenberg, which was the day before All Saints. So basically, I mean, it corresponds more or less to before All Saints. So that's when, still today, actually, at least French Protestant and German Protestant churches, and I think in the Togo, Guillaume, you might also be doing that, I'm sure, in the Presbyterian churches. I mean, churches that trace their roots back to the European Reformation tend to keep this holiday, which is not so common, I believe, in the US, even amongst Protestant churches.
It wasn't really celebrated in the Church of England, as far as I knew. The first time I ever heard about it was when I came here, from somebody who'd been raised in the Lutheran, very strongly in the Lutheran tradition.
Yeah, so you see here there's kind of a polemic in the background when this feast was instituted on that specific Sunday in October. And you can see that it's also very polemical in relationship to the state or society that kind of emerges as civil society or civic society, a society that's kind of defining its own rules, separated from the church's authority. And you're thinking, if you think also in the context in which the Pope is and the headquarters basically of the Roman Catholic Church are at that time, that's really the moment when the Italian state is taking over Italians, literally. So there are a lot of fights, really, at that time between the church and the local authorities, civic authorities. This famous, played by Fernandel, Don Camillo, if you know the show, played by Fernandel. Is a French show where it's set in Italy in these years, where Don Camillo is always in rivalry with Pepone, who is the communist mayor of the city, and Don Camillo is, of course, the representative there of the Roman Catholic Church. It's very funny, but it really shows the tension at play in Italian society, which influenced and still does influence very much the position of the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope. And it's interesting that this original date of celebration was switched and moved after the Vatican II Council. That is the council that forwarded the update, both the ressourcement and renewal of the church. So going back 60s, to the roots, and also renewing the church to be both more relevant to the antiquity of the church and be relevant to the challenges and issues at stake of the church in the modern world. And so the date was moved, and interestingly enough, we'll see that had some implications also for its reception. Yeah.
Yes, here on the left you can see Mussolini was arrested in Switzerland in 1903 before he became the dictator in Italy. It's a sort of track record. And then on the right there you can see King Vittorio Emanuele, the third. So as Joris has just mentioned, this commemoration of Christ the King was a response to the rise of fascism in Italy under Mussolini. He became the president of a council because he was appointed by the King of Italy at the time, the rise of Italian nationalism and the rise of Italian fascism.
Yeah. Now it's interesting that you see that there is a global fear of the Roman Catholic institutions, and I think the theology also of the Roman Catholic Church and even its ecclesiology, which understood a very intense relationship with political powers that's being threatened at that time. In Italy with the rise of fascism, though sometimes they also hoped, as you see in this quote, that this well-ordered discipline, peace and harmony would kind of coincide with fascism. So is it actually a reaction against fascism in that context? That could be. But it's also a reaction against all the Republican movements of the time, which were fascism kind of tried to accommodate a role for a form of very strict Roman Catholicism as long as it served interests of the fascist ideology, just like we see today in so many places of the world where religious nationalism or religions of all kinds, Hinduism, Christianity, or any and different forms of Christianity, can serve political ideologies and really merge with them in very nefarious ways. And here you see, so there's both the tension of this, both the attraction and repulsion of a lot of Catholicism, especially in Italy, but also in South America, towards fascism, and the claim of Christ being the king of society, basically, kind of stands in this context. I think it's quite interesting to notice that. A couple of years before that, you had the separation of church and state in France, which was a big blow for the Roman Catholic Church, as France is considered the first daughter of the church. And here in Italy, they hoped, and still today, I mean, there has been after some form of separation, but in Italy, it's still very, very present that the church, the Roman Catholic Church, and the state are kind of working hand in hand. So there are all this tension that are at play at that moment about basically the power you can have over the faithful or the citizens. The question is there.
There's a great overlap in rhetoric as well, in the preaching, in the political speeches.
Exactly.
You see a great overlap in the way in which people were trying to be persuaded.
Yes, exactly. I mean, this text is really striking for that.
Yeah. You wouldn't think it was written by a pope.
Society will at last receive the great blessing of real liberty, well-ordered discipline, peace and harmony. Sounds like a fascist dream a little bit.
Yes, it does, doesn't it?
It's interesting because there is this neighborhood that's built by Mussolini in the south of Rome that's called Eur, that was built actually for the... when Rome was the Olympic city, which was in the 20s, I believe, or early, 20s, which has a huge church as well, which really embodies the fascist ideology, Christian ideology, with these bulky statues of St. Peter and St. Paul's who look like they've spent more time at the gym than in prayer or fishing. Yes, but that's definitely part of this kind of muscular Christianity ideology, claiming the kingship of Christ. It's not so much the kingship that we are going to dive into as we see, because there is definitely a kingship of Christ, but as it was understood more in the Second Vatican Council as a universal kingship, a eschatological kingship, something that has a spiritual dimension and not so much this reaction to political ideologies of the time. Yeah.
Yes, here he is, Mussolini. He's not standing up at the back there holding the paper. He's just below there, standing up with his medals and uniform on there. He's addressing on this, the 3rd of January 1925, a very famous speech in the Italian Chamber of Deputies. He made this great speech. It's considered to be the very moment where Italy went over to fascism, and immediately after this speech he published decrees that suppressed the freedom of the press, it suppressed the freedom to gather, and it suppressed other political parties in Italy. So it was the beginning of Mussolini's dictatorship. And interestingly, the Roman Catholic Church didn't directly oppose that dictatorship. There was a complex relationship with it. But of course it collapsed in 1943 because of World War II, so it lasted for almost 20 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, as I mentioned also, the overall context in Europe, so we looked at the context in Italy, but the overall context in Europe was the secularization of societies at the same time when actually Christianity was spreading throughout the world through missions and colonization. But most European states of the time began to ignore the social and moral teaching of the church as a whole. There's this form of this idea of a separation, a growing separation between what the church and the churches teach, and what people aspire to in the social sphere.
Things like the role of women, things like the organisation of educational curricula, prayer in public, the
religion at school, and all these questions.
Yes, a whole raft of other questions. The rise in the permissibility of divorce, for instance, in secular society. In certain European states.
So for many states, actually, the church is tended to be viewed as a form of a source of dissension. I know one of the reasons why, for instance, the French deputies refused for a long time to give women the right to vote is because they thought they would be more easily influenced by the priest. So if women were given the right to vote, they may actually be voting in favor of more Catholic-leaning politics, not pure good Republican ideas. So there's all this fear of a state within the state when it comes to the social power and moral power of the churches. And we're talking about it in general. I'm not saying good or bad. It's just a fear that was there at the time. And there's also the real great importance throughout the 1800s, throughout the 19th century, of socialist movements throughout Europe and America that threaten, for most of them, because most socialist movements were not Christian socialist movements. I mean, there were a lot of that were really critical of at least organized religion, even if they were theist or religious in some form. They would often have very harsh critiques against the church as an institution, as its role in caption of wealth and exploitation of the poor, kind of creating a form of leniency against, misery. So there has been a lot of critiques from the Roman Catholic Church, an attempt to respond to this socialist critique. And here you have this proclamation of Christ the King, and it's the kingship also, which is not a democratic model, that's reinforced there in the 1920s when the encyclical is published.
And I think certainly Bonhoeffer saw the same secularism rising in Germany, and the way that the state had sort of monopolized that.
The Lutheran Church.
The Lutheran Church had co-opted some of that language and all of the rest of it.
Yeah.
And Bonhoeffer was very much of the view that the kingdom of Christ is not of this world.
Yeah.
And even to overlap in terms of the rhetoric around kingship that the Catholic Church is trying to co-opt here would be a dangerous move.
Yeah, and there's a lot, even within the Catholic Church, there has been a lot of critiques, as we will see, criticisms about this feast and how it's been shaped. And that's why Vatican II really updated it to make it, more relatable, I think, in many ways, and more theologically sound, I would say. Well, the other great fear, and probably the major fear in the 1920s, is the Russian Revolution, which happened in 1917, just after the war. And there was really the idea of building a new society without God. And the Orthodox Church in Russia suffered a great blow from it. So there's what's kind of a shame I find behind the institution of this new feast. It has started from fear and really polemical attitude. Whereas there are, of course, a kingship of Christ, but it can be looked at it differently. And I think with time, it was kind of edited and reformed in ways that are now a bit more hopeful.
Yes, I hope so. Yeah.
Here you have a picture of Soviet children protesting against Christmas in Moscow in 1929. I don't think we'll see many children protesting against Christmas today.
Exactly. Yeah.
There's a question. Bonhoeffer saw the same secularism rise in Germany. Yeah, definitely. And he also called out the secularization of theologians themselves, the secularizing of theology. I think we have made a couple of videos on our YouTube channel about secularism and its impact on the liturgy, its impact on how you read scripture, its impact on how you basically relate to yourself and to God. That is, you create a world where God has no agency of his own, but something that you can manipulate very easily. Yeah. So there are some roots. So we said it's kind of something recent, started in the 1920s, but there are some roots of this devotion to Christ the King that go back to the 1860s in France, for instance, with a couple of books. Henri Ramière, Le règne de Jésus-Christ dans l'histoire. You can see just the title gives you an idea. Or Charles Bernard, Le règne social du Christ. You see in both these titles. I've not even read the books. I've read summaries. But it's really interesting because at the same time you would have sociologists publishing books like Renan, all of these sociologists that try to understand history, also write about the history. That's the time when you have the building of national histories, modern national histories, with the big fight of different history narratives too. I mean, the German history, the French history that understands itself, builds nationhood by building also a common history, and that's also spread around the world through colonial empires. So there's definitely the important at that time to write big historical narratives which are kind of influenced by the philosophy of history of the time as well. Hegel has come by, and people want to rewrite the history, make something kind of holistic, rewrite the whole history of the world, saying, making a big ideology that's telling about Christ, and so it's definitely the mindset of the time to have this kind of summary of everything and looking at it through a lens that tends to be often historical and sociological. So the fact that they call Jesus the king, which has an impact on the social sphere and the public sphere and all this type of thing, is definitely linked into this context.
I was thinking that it stands out in such contrast to Bernanos or Péguy or Rouault, the artist, and others, or even some of the composers like Poulenc in France, who responded to this very secular way of monopolizing political discourse and turning Jesus into a king and talking about social order and everything by a movement towards mysticism. And Péguy ends up saying, everything begins in mysticism and ends in politics.
Yes, exactly.
And you can see how the mystics in that same time period are rebelling against this this movement, even from within the church itself.
Yes, exactly. There's a deep critique within the Roman Catholic Church, I think, and we'll see in other Protestant churches it really becomes more popular later in the 70s, but within the Roman Catholic Church it's not unanimous, far from it. Yeah, because the feast, as we just said, was basically applauded by the most reactionary Roman Catholics who didn't like the tendency towards what they would see as the secularization of government, which meant a lot of losing power for clerics and religious leaders. And they were also critical of... But what's interesting in polemics is that usually when you engage in polemic with someone, you tend in the end to use the same categories. Just invert them. And that's exactly what they're doing in that context, unfortunately, by wanting to establish this, basically Christ the King, just like in certain kingdoms, like in Belgium, you had the feast of the La Dynastie, I think it was last week actually, the feast of the King's Dynasty. You have the King's Day in the Netherlands, in the United Kingdom as well. And here they want to establish a form of Christ the King Sunday, which is kind of doubling these national feasts, interestingly enough. It was criticized. It was applauded by some, but also criticized by others, and certain people who were actually deep liturgical scholars and monastics, for saying it's a doubling of the Epiphany, which is already the feast of Christ's kingship, because that's when the Magi, the kings from the east, come and worship Christ, the little babe. So here you see that there's also, it's not the image of this tall man in a throne. Here it's a little child in a crib, and the kings are coming to him. So there's a form of entering into the mystery of what Christ's kingship is, but from the viewpoint of his life, his history, which is not one of triumph, of the hard hand of power. So the critique that Epiphany is already doing it, I think, is very good and very relevant.
I think so too. It's where the kings of the earth come and throw their crowns before Christ the child. It's a far more powerful idea than an abstract idea of Christ the King.
Yeah.
It's rooted in biblical history, it's rooted in the prophets, it's rooted in the story of Christ's birth and everything else. It's been different.
And there were also two other interesting impacts of keeping Epiphany as Christ the King, basically, feast, was that it was a popular celebration. It's always been, I mean, for a very long time in both Americas or in Europe. In France, we have the Fête des Rois, King's Cake, in Louisiana as well. There are a lot of merriments around it, and people can relate to it in a very incarnate ways because of all the carols. I mean, think of how many carols there are about the Epiphany and the three kings of Orient are coming to Jesus. So there are a lot of popular, grounding, incarnate, embodied traditions around this celebration that talk and meditate and help us enter the mystery of Christ's kingship. So why bother to make another one except for polemical reasons, really? And the other one is that it's also ecumenical, that Epiphany is celebrated in the East and the West. It's not a separate feast set up by the primate of the West, as the Pope called himself. So it had also this interesting dimension of gathering the church together around Christ as the king, the newborn king. So in the end, Christ, the Sunday of Christ the King, can be viewed and has been criticized for being a rather doctrinaire and reactionary feast in the context of the 1920s, basically, in Europe.
And definitely, yes, a needed re-enchantment. There's nothing terribly enchanting about an abstract title, but the re-enchantment of the idea of meditating on Christ's kingship in terms of the Epiphany and 12th night and the darkest time of the year when the light begins to shine and people see this authority emerging into the world in a humble child. I think, yes, that's far more enchanting than a doctrinaire or reactionary Christ the King. So
all in all, the feast was celebrated in the Roman Catholic Church with really varying conviction and amidst polemic at the mid 19th century. But thank God, during Vatican II, they even thought of cancelling it, but instead they decided to reform it and to make it about Christ's cosmic and eschatological kingship. And this, I think, made the feast really relatable and more relatable, especially where it's placed now at the end of liturgical year. So I think that's why also other churches have took it on. And for, I think, an interesting reason, because it ends the liturgical calendar year, kind of summarizes everything, all the life of Christ as King. And the lectionary, the selections that are given for the lectionary, the new readings that were decided, because there were a first set of reading appointed in the 1920s that was very much kind of reactionary. And then it was Vatican II, they decided to update the readings, update also the liturgy for it, which made it more relatable, I think, and more ecumenical also. Do you want to say something?
No, I put these two pictures up because you can see here it's the Roman Catholic reading, the United Methodist reading, the Episcopal reading. But at the bottom there, you can see it's given two different titles. One, Christ the King Sunday, and the other one, The Reign of Christ, which seems to acknowledge it's a bit dodgy, this title, Christ the King Sunday. It's more about the reign of Christ in a cosmic, universal way.
And it's interesting because in the same time you also have Teilhard de Chardin, who rethinks what's Christ. Teilhard de Chardin is a French Jesuit who actually lived 2 streets away from where the French church is here in New York City, and he died. He's buried actually up there at Hudson River, and he had this whole reflection together, linking back to psychology and comment on appelle evolution of species, to look at Christ as kind of a cosmic reality as well. In the Phénomène humain, for instance, he talks about that. And so there's this rereading in the 60s, 70s, together with the exploration of space, together with the development of natural sciences in new ways, that tend to want to look at Christ's reign within and beyond creation. That I think is kind of hopeful. I wonder if there would be some ways of even tying into ecological concerns there. So. In the Reign of Christ Sunday. Definitely a selection of hymns we have for Sunday tying these themes for sure. So the feast of the Reign of Christ or Christ the King Sunday became more popular because of ecumenism and the interest that Christian churches had after the Second World War to grow closer and to develop their relations less in a polemical way, but more in a brotherly way. And the Second Vatican Council was a very important step towards, it's not full reconciliation, but at least friendly and brotherly relations between different Christian denominations. And because the Vatican Council had ecumenical guests, and as kind of a response also to all the work that was done by the Roman Catholic Church during the Second Vatican Council, many Western churches, Lutherans, Anglicans, Reformed, Moravians, Methodists, also updated their liturgy and their work. So that's been a long process throughout the 20th century to reform the churches. It's not only the Roman Catholic Church, but all churches have undergone some form of liturgical reforms, usually centering, going back to the origins of Christian worship, because the scientific research on that topic had evolved, also a lot of research on the history of the liturgy. And so they decided to go back and see how basically we could also take on this tradition as a form of ecumenical sharing. Alors, lost in translation. I see there's a comment in the chat, Nigel. Lost in translation, question mark. In Greek, the crown or king ID, like reign, has lost the royal title in English.
Yes, King, König, Kaiser, Caesar. Is that where we're going with that? Basileus. Yeah. That's an interesting idea, actually. I think it's when we think of Basileus king, it has a very specific political connotation to it, whereas the shift has become more towards this idea of the cosmic reign of Christ, of the redemption of all creation that groans in travail for the coming of the one who will redeem all of creation and make things good, not just for human beings in terms of political, social order, as we saw in the papal encyclical, but for everything, everyone, for the cosmos itself.
Yes, exactly.
I think this shift
is very interesting, I find. And so, as I said, so many Protestant and other Western churches have taken on this feast, and the feast is today unofficially celebrated in some Episcopal parishes. I think our own is part of that. But when did we start, actually, Nigel?
Celebrating Christ the King? I think we've sort of shifted around with it. I can't even remember if we celebrated Reformation Sunday when I first arrived. I know people wanted to do it, but I don't really know, to be honest. I think it's sort of floated between a harvest Thanksgiving that's got this cosmic Christ aspect to it, and the Christ the King readings in anticipation sort of Advent, where we're waiting for the return of Christ, and what formed those expectations in terms of messianic hopes about what would a king look like what would a Messiah look like? And one of, several aspects of that include nobody goes hungry, people are healed, all of creation lives in harmony with itself and with others. I think that's been the thrust of what we've tried to do on that particular Sunday, folding it into the idea of Thanksgiving a little bit as well.
It's interesting.
It's a bit of a dog's dinner.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because in the American context with Thanksgiving, that always falls around that time as well. You have the creation that forces its way into Christ the King Sunday.
Yes.
So it's kind of interesting. And you have basically, you start with, you have Christ the King at the end of November, and then basically months after you have the Nativity of Christ. So it's interesting.
The collect is interesting, isn't it, there? It's this was something that you found, Joris, here. The free adaptation of a Roman Catholic collect that's slipped into our Book of Common Prayer, not officially, it's unofficially celebrated in some Episcopal parishes. But if we look at that collect, it's interesting, isn't it? It says, restore all things in your well-beloved Son. Here we're going with the cosmic Christ idea. But then it shifts. The King of Kings, Lord of Lords, will mercifully grant that the peoples of the earth may be freed and brought together under his gracious rule. So it's hovering between the cosmic Christ of restoring all things and the political King who freed and brought together under his most gracious
interestingly
rule.
It's not set in the bound of kind of a national state. That's kind of it's all nations will come.
Yes.
That's that's what it is, but that's interesting.
And we'll certainly come back to the kingdom of heaven in a minute and discuss that.
So as we've seen, there's been really a wrestling with the mystery of Christ's kingship through this almost 100 year of Christ the King, or reign of Christ Sunday. At the beginning, it was about some form of a social reign of Christ the King. We've realized also that there is kind of a danger of celebrating a title and not an event of Christ's life, because it always tends to make us understand this title not according to the biblical events, which are, so many different characters, so much to unpack. Whereas we tend, if we just have a title, to copy our contemporary ideas, to just copy-paste our contemporary ideas and experiences linked to the word, for instance, or the concept itself. Like, what you think of a king, Christ the King, well, you think Christ is like a king like this on this painting. And it's very dangerous or misleading, I think, to enter mysteries starting with a title. I think that's the big problem also of identity politics in many ways, is that you start with giving someone an identity and then you try to enter the mystery of who they are. But if you start with, labeling things, then you cannot really go deep.
There's no Feast of Christ the CEO.
No.
Although maybe there should be nowadays, since CEOs are more powerful than kings in certain
I'm not sure the CEOs are in the Bible, though. Kingship is in the Bible.
Christ the manager.
Yes, definitely.
Christ the leader. Yes.
But there's definitely no Feast of Christ the Word, no Feast of the Son of Man. So it's kind of, you're wondering why there is this special Feast of Christ, the King, right? And so there's been this shift, as we said, from the social to universal kingship of Christ, as we saw in the history of the development of the celebration, but also in the thinking and understanding of the mystery of it. So Christ's kingship is shared together with the Father and the Holy Spirit. So that's a critique or a criticism you can address to this feast, really, is that it's a Trinitarian kingship. And that means a lot, actually, when Jesus talks about the kingdom, most of the time he talks about the kingdom of his Father, the kingdom of heaven. He doesn't claim the kingdom for his own. It's definitely some form of relationship. And that's the network. I mean, the reality of the kingdom is relationship. So to kind of put Jesus on a pedestal there as the king is very misleading, on a throne up there, it's very misleading for us to understand the mystery of Christ's reign.
Yes, God is king, the Holy Spirit is king. How does it feel shifting the titles around a little bit?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey ho.
So it's definitely, yes, a form of universal kingship that we're invited to enter or think about, meditate about. There's this shift that happened with the Vatican II, and today I think that's inviting us to think that he's not the king of such particular society, particular context, but a form of spiritual kingship.
Yes, that was a good point that you raised there, Joris, that when Christ talks about the kingdom, but he doesn't talk about his kingdom. We've got the kingdom of God, as has been pointed out in the chat, or the kingdom of heaven. And it's also a kingdom that is to come.
Yeah.
Yes.
Interestingly enough, I looked it up, and the only time, it seems to me, that he talks about his kingdom is when he's in a polemic discussion with a secular authority that is Pilate himself. That's when he answers, "My kingdom is not of this world." But it's only in this context that he says, "My kingdom." Otherwise, this is my Father's.
Yes.
You know?
Yes, and he doesn't say, it's a good point there about the CEO Solomon. He said that all of this earthly power is vanity. So Jesus doesn't say, "My company is not of this world," or my limited company is not of this world, or it's not floated on the stock exchange.
No. So he also always eludes, the moments when they try to make him king. He flees after he's fed the 5,000. And really the context in which you can enter the mystery of Christ's kingship is but his passion and what he says, how he behaves, how he's treated in this moment is what really helps us understand what Christ's kingship is. His passion, his resurrection, his ascension is really how Christ becomes curious. He becomes the Lord. And the cross is his throne. That's really the reality of Christ's kingship. So you see the danger or the difficulty to have a separate feast that talks about Christ's kingship separately from Holy Week, Easter, and Epiphany liturgies. It's complicated because it can be misleading, and it can lend itself very easily to be politically used to support certain ideas about kind of control and authority, or there was a reading of the gospel today when Jesus looks at the temple from the Mount of Olives and says, some people will come and say, "I am he." Yes. So there's a lot of tendency, it's kind of easy to have messianic political leaders or messianic understanding of Christ as kind of this big guy who is bossing you around. And that feast, I think, creates the possibility of that quite easily. But there might still be a virtue of Christ the King Sunday at the end of the liturgical year, because it kind of summarizes all of the mysteries of the salvation that we've lived step by step throughout the liturgical year. And it's also because it's just at the end of the liturgical calendar and just before Advent, it also turns us towards the kingdom yet to come.
Yep.
So it's not, the Sunday after Easter, for instance, which would be really terrible.
Be very annoying.
Yes, which would be very terrible. Here there's kind of a brokenness to it because it's at the end of the liturgical calendar, which I guess you can redeem it if you look at it generously, I would say.
Yes.
Yes. So a couple of things to say about this celebration again. And all liturgically loose or loosely liturgical holidays that exist in the calendar, even of the Episcopal Church. they usually tend to be more about a concept than about a moment in the life of Christ, the church, or a saint. I have to say a concept or an event in secular history.
Yes.
Because there could be a national holiday, for instance, there would be.
Yeah.
But that's usually what they tend to be. So they tend to be about something that don't necessarily relate to the embodied life of Christ, the embodied life of the church, or the embodied life of a saint. It can also be a devotion, for instance, very particular devotion. So more of about an object, if you want, or some form of practice than about a fully mysterious embodied life. Usually secular commemoration, there's usually tend to be secular commemorations or particular devotions that have made their way into the liturgical calendar, because they usually are moments of popular celebration. And I mean, at Saint-Esprit, we have many moments of popular celebrations that have somehow made their way into our liturgy too, but always contained, because we keep the readings, for instance, appointed for the day. And sometimes it's difficult to preach.
Yes,
Nice fun,
especially when Bastille Day coincides with the beheading of John the Baptist.
I know, it's kind of easy to make the connection, but it's a bit...
It's interesting to
facile.
read those events through Scripture and not let them boss you around.
Exactly.
In terms
And I think
of,
that's the danger. Basically, what has happened and what can always happen is that in the end, Nigel, you would decide, let's choose readings that match Afrique Fête or Bastille Day. And that's what, the church has tended to be, sometimes under the influence of certain groups. And actually, I didn't mention that, but it was a feast of Christ, the Redeemer, that was popular in Italy and almost made its way into the universal calendar of the church. But it was really happened because of the lobbying of the Redemptorists, which are a group of an order within the Roman Catholic Church. So you see, people have their own agenda, their own kind of particular devotion, own personal history that can be honored within the context of the liturgy, and that's part of the inculturation, the fact that we live a life in context, in a certain culture. But if they tend to take too much of the space, sometimes it can be kind of distraction.
Yes.
And there are many examples, and a lot of this also has to do about how you do it. No? What do you think, Nigel?
I agree. I think I put the example up there of Reformation Sunday because the poster here, or whatever it is all about concepts. Grace alone, faith alone, Scripture alone. I think it's interesting that as soon as you rally around a concept, you may very well read the Bible quite selectively.
Yeah, exactly.
And you won't allow it to read you.
Yeah.
And yes, it depends on how you do it. We haven't really celebrated Independence Day that much at Saint-Esprit.
No.
We sort of flirt with Thanksgiving, mostly because we like to welcome people and give them a nice party if they've got no families, and people to cook for in great number here. Labor Day tends to be a holiday, as in Europe it would be May Day, wouldn't it? The Feast of the Worker. But we have the Feast of St. Joseph the Worker. So some of these are reduplicated, and the church attempting to reclaim a secular movement for itself rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting, and because sometimes this feast that becomes so particular are also kind of reactionary. I mean, Reformation Sunday, it's good, but if you think ecumenically, it can be a bit, we're the good ones, they're the bad ones. And Independence Day, Nigel, for you as a British, I'm sure it's kind of a day of mourning.
Increasingly so.
Anyway, but yes, that's interesting because you have all this often dependent on local cultures, festival that made their way sometimes in the calendar of the church. In the Roman Catholic Church, there are actually provisions for each diocese to define certain feasts depending on, for instance, their local saint or special commemorations. In the Episcopal Church, you see that as well. In Anglican churches throughout the world, there are, of course, adaptations depending on the regime, the political regime, so celebrations of how is it called in English? The feast for the king.
Oh, it's the anniversary of coronation, the official birthday.
There's a special collect for that?
I think so. I can't remember. I mean, there's always a petition to bless the king or the queen in morning or evening prayer.
It reminded me actually when I was looking into this French Book of Common Prayer that was published in 1850s in Paris. There was a special collect for l'Empereur and the Imperatrice, Napoleon III and Eugénie. So there's definitely some form of, response to special national holidays, celebrations, thinking a lot about also the questions of veterans and celebrations of wars, with all the questions it also brings, how the church is, participating in this type of celebrations. But it really all depends, as we just said, that the way you organize them, this type of celebrations, I find, when they're kind of loosely related to biblical celebrations or biblical stories. Because sometimes some like secular political agenda can kind of try to use the aura of religious services to sanctify what is really worldly ways and structures. There can be structures of abuse or imperialism or any form of, to what extent when you're doing a lot of chaplaincy in armies that are, participating in war crimes or things like this, are you actually blessing them, and supporting the whole structures of it? Are you just attending to the needs of the of the soldiers, because they do have spiritual and pastoral needs, and they cannot access them in a church? Or are you actually kind of blessing the military and its endeavors that can be even condemned by international law, or by Christian moral? So you see, it's a really fine line to walk without losing sight of Jesus's upside down kingdom, that the fact that he brings good news to the poor, to the powerless, and is not is not uncritical of the evil structures of this world.
That's right. I was interested. I was talking to somebody the other day about the difference between Remembrance Day and Memorial Day as a day in America to celebrate the armed services, and another day to remember the war dead. I think that's right. There's two.
There are two different holidays.
There are two different holidays. I think it's something to do with the Civil War. I'm not entirely sure. Thank goodness it wasn't in my citizenship exam. But in England, the two come together on something called Remembrance Sunday, which is held closest to the 11th of November. And there's an attempt in those to sing stories about empires passing away, oh God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, where it's a mixture between being thankful for those who served in the armed forces and to be aware of the dangers of war. There are no special readings for it, as far as I remember. The services themselves are held around war memorials. But it's an interesting combination. You're not giving thanks for military power. You're holding that at the same time as remembering those who have paid the cost for that.
Now, there's definitely a fine line to walk, and it really depends on the sermon. That's where the sermon also plays a very important role in the liturgy, the selection of the role you're giving also to representatives of any form of institution, in that case. So if you're interested in learning more about these challenges, you can watch our course on the liturgy, because I think we covered that in a couple of videos. Saying the tension that's at play there between within the liturgy, the kingdom of God and the kingdom of the kingdoms of this world.
I think it's called liturgy and secularism.
Yes, maybe it's in that one. Yes. And so as I was diving in this topic and looking up the collects, I realized that in the English language Episcopal BCP, the collect for Independence Day is under the section Holy Days, which I thought was kind of
a little odd.
Very odd. But they couldn't do it. So that's really showing the tendency to Christian nationalism within the Episcopal Church, which is no surprise, of course. But there is this kind of association of America and Holy Day, which is strange.
Strange.
But what's very strange is that the Labor Day is not under holidays. It has a separate collect that you can find at the end of all the general collects, Labor Day collect. So you see where America's preference goes towards the nation and maybe capital than the poor workers who have built this nation.
Who are shunted into a sort of subsidiary collect.
Yes, exactly.
If you want to use it for Labor Day, here it is.
Yes, so it's not considered a holiday, whereas Independence Day is.
Yeah.
And Thanksgiving is as well.
And it is a very fine line, as has been pointed out in the chat, between the sacred and the profane. It's sometimes very difficult to draw that line in a faith that is founded on an incarnational principle.
Yes.
Where what are you using for what?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's asking very good questions also about, what is sacred and what is not, or how do we, so many questions. Oop.
We're coming towards the end. I found this little quotation from John Caputo in his book, The Folly of God. It's quite a good book, this. The kingdom does not exist, it insists. The coming of the kingdom is not to be confused with a past, present, or future present state of affairs. It's not an existent past, present, or future. The kingdom does not exist, it calls. The kingdom is the folly of an unconditional call, a call to live unconditionally, to offer unconditional mercy, hospitality, and forgiveness. It would be mythological and half blasphemous to literalize it as an existent state of affairs, an episode containable in a geographical place or datable in calendar time. When it comes to the coming of the kingdom, every land is a holy land, and every day a holy day.
That's a beautiful text, I think. The kingdom does not exist, it calls.
Yes.
This is very profound. Because I think the problem when you start to just talk about the kingdom as kingdom is that you look at the structure and we're thinking of Christ as the king, as a person. And the kingdom does not exist, it calls us, because Christ calls us as the king into the kingdom. And there is a interpersonal relationship at stake, not a relationship to a system or to stuff.
And open-ended in terms of faith, hope, and love, as been pointed out, not power and control.
Yeah, and fraternity and fellowship. That's a beautiful text. The Folly of God, a Theology of the Unconditional. That's an
interesting book.
Must be a good book.
Yeah. And of course, I'll leave that one to you.
By Pierre de Caussade, who is actually not the author, but is attributed to Pierre de Caussade. It's probably by an unknown author, maybe a woman. Abandonment to divine providence. For those who abandon themselves to it, God's love contains every good thing. And if you long for it with all your heart and soul, it will be yours. All God asks for is love. And if you search for this kingdom where God alone rules, you can be quite sure you will find it. For if your heart is completely devoted to God, your heart itself is this treasure, this very kingdom which you desire so ardently.
Yeah. Yes, the feast of Jesus the President. I'm not sure I'd want that.
No. That's interesting because it's born in your heart, and so much about the kingdom comes by you experience the kingdom also by feeling your incarnation and being incarnate, not by trying to look up to certain outside form of representative or some outside structures in this world.
They'll always betray, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's very profound, as always, with the abandonment to divine providence.
Yeah. Well, there we are.
Well, there are a lot of people who want to make Jesus president.
Yes.
I think Jesus would have just run away if you wanted to make him president.
Just like he ran away when they wanted to make him a king, too.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. It's an interesting idea.
Do you have any remarks, questions, any last thought, Nigel?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm still mixed about the idea of the Sunday. It's clarified it's clarified the way I think about it, and sort of helped me not to take certain things for granted.
Yeah.
It's funny, I once asked a question, how many people in the congregation had been born in a country that had a monarch, either a king or a queen or something. And several people put their hands up, actually, not just English and Japanese people, but from other unexpected parts of the world too, where there was a chieftain who had a king's title. And I'm not sure if it changes your perspective on what a feast dedicated to Christ the King would look like.
Yeah.
There's certainly a sense, or at least there was in the previous Queen in England, of continuity, solidarity, dependability, and not an overbearing, overweening exercise of power, a certain sense of glamour and stability and tradition, which marries quite well with...
and gossip in purple press.
Yes, exactly. With what you'd expect from, the Church of England in that sort of sense.
Yes.
So I can see the attraction of thinking about kingliness in terms.
No, that's true. I mean, it has definitely. It's a motif. I mean, it's a reality, a mystery kingship that's pervasive in the Bible. From God kind of appoints us human beings as kings and rulers of a creation in Genesis, and all this, Davidic line and all these things. So it's a very important mystery that this feast might actually be able to make us enter into. Yeah.
It looks like Fred has arrived in Guatemala, and I love the title, Jesus the I Am, the Feast of the I Am.
That would be a good idea. Or the feast of, God, He is who He is.
Yes. Yeah.
That would be good. Yeah.
It's deeply rooted into that John's Gospel and the
I am who you say. Yeah.
I am I am who I am and will be. Yeah.
Our common prayer had praise for Regina.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. In the Canadian Book of Common Prayer, I think there's quite a prayers for the... I once served in a church where there was a very old prayer book where they'd crossed out Victoria and put the succession of Edwards and Georges, and then eventually
they had to buy new copies, gosh.
Right, they just pencil it out.
Well, we hope King Charles will live
long enough to outlast the latest print edition of the English Book of Common Prayer.
Although I saw that he said that he was King of France in the latest version.
I don't think they've given that one up, have they?
Anyway, well, I'm looking forward, Nigel, to hearing your sermon on Sunday after this meditation we've had. And come on Sunday if you want to see what we've done also of the liturgy as a whole, as this mixed bag of Thanksgiving and Christ the King all together.
Yes, and if you're disappointed, stay for lunch and that will make up for it.
Great. Well, we're going to wish you all a good evening. If you want to join us on Zoom, will be a pleasure to see you if you're watching live. If not, I think next week we're not going to have Bible study, right?
That's right, because it's
Yes.
the eve of the
It's the
holidays.
eve of Thanksgiving. But see you in 2 weeks' time now.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Have a good night.
Bonne nuit, and thanks for joining us.
Bonjour, au revoir.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bonne soirée.
Thank you for being with us.